.com. Camera metering and exposure is always wrong. What do I mean by that? I mean that capture brightness should not be thought of the same as the brightness of the final image. And so we have a situation here in the age of AI where cameras routinely discard much of the potential of the sensor because the software programming is essentially from the film era. But it's actually worse than that when you think about push and pull. So let's look at these pictures here to demonstrate that. On the left, we have an as metered camera shot. You can see it's very dark. +0 means that's what the camera metered. It's very dark, obviously too dark. Over on the right, over here, we have one that's way too bright. Maybe it would serve in a pinch. No, not really. Actually, the one at 9/3, which is blown out, is actually the optimal exposure for the sensor, if you can believe that. 2 1/3 stops more. About the right brightness is shown here in the center at +4/3. And what I'd like to show you is with JPEG, the camera will meter a value like +0, and then produce a JPEG whose brightness is exactly what it metered. In other words, it decided that whatever it meters to a medium gray, we might say an 18% gray, is what it produces. So if you have an image with a lot of white in it, like this one, snow, it says, let's make that 18% gray. And sure enough, all the whites are grayish. And so that's what you get in your JPEG unless you do something about it by, like exposure compensation. The actual correct brightness, which is different than the actual correct exposure, is somewhere around 3/3, that's 1 stop more, or 4/3, 1 1/3 stop, somewhere just right around there. That's the actual output brightness that should be there. It means the metering, at the very least, should have metered a stop brighter to generate this. The camera could do this in various ways, but has no facility for doing so. It just tries to make that dull medium gray tone. Now, what's important to understand here is that the metered exposure is not the one you need to make to produce the final brightness. So if we look at JPEG, we have everything +0 to +1/3, +2/3, 3/3, 4/3, and so on, all the way up until 3 2/3 stop brighter. And the JPEG we get reflects those brightnesses directly. However, if we shoot RAW, the capture brightness is not the same as the output brightness. These images have been adjusted, and you can see they're all identical. Every last one of them up until +8/3. You can see there's no difference. These are all different capture exposures, all coming to the same final brightness. They've been pulled appropriately. These last three are overexposed, truly overexposed. The color starts to shift, so we don't need those. But there's one last one, the +8/3, which actually is the brightest exposure we could have made, and still got no color shift and well, actually it looks like +7/3. There's a slight color shift at 8. So 2 1/3 stop brighter capture equates to the same result as the darker ones, but with far less noise. That's the critical part. And that's our capture exposure, but our brightness exposure is down here at +3/3, well, around that range at least. So we could give it 2 1/3 stop more exposure. So what's going on here? Well, and first of all, when the camera meters at +0, what are the repercussions of this metering? You get too dark or too bright JPEGs. You get underexposed RAW files. You get higher noise and lower dynamic range. You get an RGB histogram that falsely shows the range of the sensor. And you have blinking highlights that are actually blinking when they shouldn't be blinking. And why does this happen? Well, it happens because film error in the film error exposure pretty much meant what you get on the negative or slide. That was it. However, there's a tweak. In the film error, you could still push and pull film. If you shot more than one sheet of film, say like in my 4x5, I used to routinely do this. I shoot 3 sheets at the same exposure. I could develop one and then push or pull the other one to adjust its brightness by more or less chemical development. We don't have that equivalent in digital cameras today. You can't say capture 4/3 stop brighter or 3/3 stop brighter and give me a JPEG that was the same brightness as +0 just for higher quality. You can't do that. You can give it +3/3 and try to make it and do your own thing and trying to adjust the brightness, but you can't actually expose more, say 7/3, and then tell the camera, well, I want to expose by 2 1/3 stop more, but give me an image that's only 1 stop brighter. You can't do that on a camera, and you could do it with film. That's rather ironic. Let's look at how you would do that in Photoshop. I've got all the captures here, and if we go up here, this is our +0. Now you notice this is the same brightness as all the other ones. I'm mousing down. I've adjusted them, and that's called a push or a pull. In this case, the +0 is an underexposure, and if I hadn't adjusted it over here, that's what it looks like. It's that too dark image. But I have added 1 stop more brightness to it. In this one, it's a +1/3 exposure. I've added 2/3 of a stop more brightness. In this case, it's 2/3 stop greater exposure, and I've added 1/3 stop more brightness. In this case, it's 3/3 of a stop, 1 stop more exposure capture brightness, and I don't make any adjustment, +0 on the exposure slider. Then as we exceed that, we go +4/3, 5/3, 6/3, 7/3. I determine this is our last good exposure, meaning nothing's been blown out and it looks identical to the other ones. You can see I've pulled it by 1.33 stops. That's 4/3 of a stop. So I pulled it 4/3 to get it to the proper brightness at 3/3, but the actual exposure is 7/3 of a stop. That's 2 1/3 stops. Higher capture brightness than the +0 this camera metered. So that camera essentially metered and gave me a capture in RAW and JPEG that was like shooting in ISO 500 instead of ISO 100. You get a grainier, noisier image for no good reason. But with the 7/3, that's 2 1/3 stop more. That's like ISO 100 instead of ISO 500. All I have to do is reduce the exposure to the desired brightness. So my capture exposure was 2 1/3 stop greater, and then I adjust the exposure down by 1 1/3 stops. So 2 1/3 minus 1 1/3 is +1 stop, which I determined is just the brightness I wanted, and it's perfect. Back in JPEG land, +7/3 here looks like that. Useless, blown out, garbage result. In RAW, perfect. So that's the coupling of capture exposure, capture brightness, I should say maybe, to final image brightness. It's coupled 1-to-1 with JPEG. It's not coupled in RAW. And that's why you shoot RAW, because you can expose more and adjust the brightness. Because let's face it, you can shoot JPEGs all day long, and every last one of them is wrong. Every last one of them is a little too bright or a little too dark, and all because of that 18% metering. If you shot scenes like this all day, every one of them would give you this dark, ridiculously dark result. It's both underexposed capture and too dark a final image. It's pretty much a dumpster fire on quality. So that's why you shoot RAW, and that's why you try to do an ETTR exposure, exposed to the right, which I'll discuss in another video. There is one thing I'll mention briefly, and that is you can get the poor man's compensation for this in some respects by shooting at ISO 50, which forces the camera to give it more exposure. So even if you get a dark exposure, it will have had more exposure. And it's probably not worth it for most people. It'd be silly. You might as well shoot RAW. Anyway, so modern cameras are basically blowing the game. They're throwing away the sensitivity of their sensor and coupling capture exposure to output brightness. That's just a fundamentally broken design, and the only way around it is to shoot RAW and sidestep it.